we're going to be focusing on the role of small-scale agroecological production solutions in responding to the COVID-19 crisis and building a more resilient foundation for what comes next. Our agenda in a nutshell is really laid out here. We're going to start by hearing from a range of agencies how they're supporting small-scale production and their differing approaches in a diversity of contexts. We're then going to dive into the role of these approaches now. What can they offer in the current crisis? And we're going to discuss some of the programming adaptations and innovations that our speakers are seeing in their programming at this time. And finally, in small breakout sessions, we're going to invite all of you, our participants and our practitioners on this call, to discuss and share with one another your own challenges, resources, solutions, and strategies. Next slide, please. To guide us through the conversation today, we have a team of 5 technical experts that you see here. I don't have time to do justice to all of their credentials here, but in a quick snapshot, we have Warren Brush joining us, a resilience design consultant and co-founder of Quail Springs Permaculture. Warren has over 30 years of experience working in agroecological education and regenerative system design, both here in the US and abroad. We also have Thomas Cole with us, a resilience design consultant and co-founder of African Women Rising. Tom has over 25 years of experience in sustainable agriculture, including working with IDP and refugee camps across East and Southern Africa. We also have Tara Clerkin, Senior Coordinator for Agriculture, Climate, and Partnerships at the International Rescue Committee. Tara's recent work includes supporting value chain and market assessments in agriculture and livestock program design across the globe from Northeast Syria to Myanmar and Somalia. Next, we have Meredith Jackson de Graffenried from Helen Keller International. She's a senior technical specialist based out of Zambia, but supporting the Asia Pacific Regional Office. Meredith holds a PhD in biocultural medical anthropology and has expertise in reducing social disparities in health and food security outcomes, as well as improving resilient livelihoods. And next we have Natalie Topa, Regional Resilience and Livelihoods Coordinator for East Africa and the Great Lakes region at Danish Refugee Council. Over the last 15 years, her work has focused on restoring community agroecosystems, tackling the root sources of ecological degradation, and enhancing resilient systems from the household level to regional scales. Now, before we jump into our technical discussion, I'd like to invite Charlie Davis to say a few words. Charlie is our agricultural officer at the USAID Office of Food for Peace and the Agreement Officer's representative for the SCALE Award. Charlie, can I turn over to you to open up the session, please?
Great, thanks a lot, Kristen. Thanks for that great introduction. And just wanted to welcome everyone. It's great to see such high turnout, even during these difficult times. And I just wanted to thank all the participants and the presenters. It's great to have such a good panel of experts here to talk about the linkages between agriculture, the environment, and food security through the support of the SCALE program that Food for Peace is really happy to partner with. And very excited to be a part of the breakout sessions as well, to talk a little more in detail with the participants and get your thoughts and feedback on how to best respond given the impacts of COVID-19 that we're still determining how to deal with. So looking forward to that, and I won't take up any more time, but would also just put a quick plug in to those of you that aren't familiar with SCALE to sign up for their mailing list and be a part of the future webinars and discussions moving forward. Thanks a lot.
That's great. Thank you, Charlie, and thank you for that SCALE plug. Now to kick us off with the introductory framing for our conversation, I'm going to turn over to Warren Brush.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, everyone, for being here with us today. So we are truly in an unprecedented time in history when most of us will remember these days of restricted movement, disrupted supply chains, and massive loss of livelihoods as a global pandemic that has changed the world as we know it. What is unique about this particular moment in time are the restrictions on our mobility and containment measures in almost every country around the globe. So truly, we're in this all together. Yet for some of the most vulnerable people in the world, COVID-19 is just one of the many cumulative and life-changing shocks they are facing on a daily basis. Many of these at-risk populations already experience the combined effects of climate change, the repercussions of land degradation, locust infestations, and on with different types of shocks and stresses. These are the populations that many of us on this call work with directly through our programs that operate in context of multiple shocks and stresses. When you combine all of those stressors together, the symptoms might emerge as hunger, it might emerge as loss of livelihoods that can lead to negative coping strategies. The more extreme end of this are some of the intercommunal clashes we often see around dwindling natural resources, and some of the highest levels on record of displacement, both internal and across borders. However, when we take a deeper look at these symptoms and track them to their primary source, we find the underlying causes are often rooted in the lack of resilience found in community and household food systems. With the case of COVID-19, we are seeing a health crisis quickly turn into a far more destructive food, nutritional, and economic crisis. Slide change, please. When looking at communities or households who experience a range of shocks, we can observe that those households who have established home-based food production, especially those that are built on sound ecologic and agronomic principles, are more productive and secure in a wide variety of conditions. Why is that? So many of us may be asking. The answer for me lies in whole system design and thinking, where small-scale agricultural systems from the household garden to the small farm are built upon connection and integration. Essentially, this type of production system is designed using the same strategies that make natural systems so stable and resilient. This holistic approach ensures that household food production is filled with biodiversity and has redundant support mechanisms that protects and nourishes the soil biome. You can go ahead and change the slide as well. And that it is a part of a greater water harvesting strategy that slows, spreads, and infiltrates water. It uses locally available organic resources, is biointensively planted with nutrient-dense perennial and annual plants, uses locally adapted seeds, and has dry season strategies to ensure year-round production. It's the same way I actually garden at my own home as well. Slide change, please. So what can be learned from this to help respond to COVID-19? Stability is based on diversity. The more we can intentionally design and support our programs to integrate and build across sectors, the more successful our programmatic outcomes will be. Yet many of our programs aren't doing that, and I've seen that around the globe. Agencies might task kitchen gardens to health and nutrition teams and field and crop production to the agricultural team with little programmatic coordination. WASH and NRM activities might take place in the same community, but are often done in isolation from each other. But agroecology teaches us to look at the strengths inherent in the linkages between these sectors, and household food production is a great place to start. A garden can utilize gray water and other household waste that often are in the realm of WASH. They can reduce or eliminate erosion in and around their gardens and fields and promote biodiversity, which is in the realm of natural resource management team. And they can help to recharge boreholes and spring lines, often tasked to the infrastructure engineers. A garden or farm that integrates deep soil preparation and seed selection within sound agronomic practices is in the realm of the agricultural teams. A biodiverse garden with multiple natural soil amendments and a healthy soil biome that grows food which is much more nutritious than one that doesn't use those practices would be in the realm of the nutrition team. A shelter that is shaded by a planted tree that also provides marketable fruit is in the realm of both infrastructure and livelihood teams. Women being able to sell those greens weekly at a local market is both livelihood and protection issue and can provide the foundation for successful VSLA growth. As you can imagine, in this type of integrated approach, the long-term ability for a household to resist or even flourish during a shock like COVID-19 is not only feasible, it is possible to attain, as you will hear about from many of our guest presenters later in this webinar. Slide change, please. One of my most formidable teachers, Bill Mollison, one of the founders of the global permaculture movement, used to say, all of the problems of the world can be solved in the garden. Over the past 25 years of wrapping my head and heart around that statement, I have found that it speaks to the truth of understanding that when we are in relationship with that which sustains us, and we tend those systems wisely using natural processes as our guide, many of the world's problems would certainly be minimized and others would cease to exist. In our next hour together, it is my hope that we can discuss some of our experiences in developing resilient food systems through a diversity of approaches and how that work has played out in this unique time of pandemic and what might be our relevant steps forward as we move from crisis to recovery. Thank you, and I look forward to these next moments together. And back to you, Kristen.
Thanks, Warren, for that fantastic setup and framing to our conversation today. I think that really gets us off on the right foot for what's going to happen next. We're now going to shift over to giving each of our presenters an opportunity to do a short overview of how their agencies have been applying those principles that we just heard about from Warren. So I'm going to start with you, Tom Cole, from African Women Rising, to share a little bit about what these principles look like in practice for your organization.
Great, thank you, Kristen, and thank you, Warren, for that nice introduction. My name is Thomas Cole, and I'm a resilience design consultant for USAID and a co-founder and technical advisor for African Women Rising. AWR started in 2006 to help women recover from conflict. They're currently working with over 20,000 women and their families in the Acholi region of northern Uganda, including Palabek refugee settlement. Their programs focus on access to capital and savings, regenerative agriculture, girls' education, and adult literacy. And the Permagarden program itself was developed building off many years' experience from multiple program sites across sub-Saharan Africa, though it was really pioneered in the post-conflict areas of Acholi land. In that context, even though we had a seemingly successful field crop agriculture program, why were our farmers still experiencing severe seasonal hunger each year? And that led to this notion of why the permagarden approach. We were seeing kitchen garden programs, or I was, across multiple contexts, either in the dry lands or areas with heavier rainfall, with minimal impact on household nutrition and income. There's often more emphasis on crops to sell and less on nutrition. Households were often struggling to keep these kitchen gardens watered, and they were often abandoned in the dry season, often not near the kitchen and with heavy pest and disease pressures. So in that context, we thought how we can move the slide, please. So we thought, how can we mitigate some of these problems and actually design a program that can harvest and store water, build soil fertility, help regenerate the environment, produce quickly and year-round, but with crops people want to be eating every day, and be replicable and done at scale. We began doing this work in Palabek refugee settlement in 2017. You can see some of the photos there. We took the site design and analytical framework of permaculture, structured the work around a core set of basic agroecological principles, and then layered in the productive strategies of biointensive agriculture. Water conservation and long-term soil fertility measures form the basis of this approach. Crop diversity and crop protection are achieved through accessing local resources, much as crop selection comes from understanding and mitigating local hunger season pressure. A regenerative lens forms the groundwork for all of this thinking. So it's an approach really to maximize crop and tree production in small spaces around the home compound, understanding that every home is different. It's not just a set of planting beds, but a series of interwoven and interlocking strategies that build on strengthening the natural environment of the whole compound. There's a minimal cost for establishment and upkeep, and does not need external inputs to build it or really to maintain it. And the success at this level, and you can see in some of those slides, provides an entry point for broader agroecological action moving out into farmer fields, throughout the community, or even into the watershed. And if we could just go to the next slide. Understanding that one of the greatest weaknesses shared by most humanitarian programs is lack of impact data, African Women Rising commissioned a participatory impact assessment of its Permagarden program in Palabek refugee settlement towards the end of 2019. The results, posted and accessible on the FSN network, show some very clear results and help to build a positive evidence base for these types of interventions, especially in displacement settings. You can see primary dry season income for camp residents in the program came from Permagardens. There's an increase in food consumption for refugee households. There's a decreased reliance on World Food Program rations, and there's widespread improvements in household nutrition. So these findings also showed that not everyone has interest in or a commitment to growing a permagarden, and that some or even many of them might fail. However, the more vulnerable who can't access land or work opportunities outside the refugee settlement are those who are most likely or more likely to use the permagarden for their economic and food security. In these times of severe restrictions on movement due to COVID-19, access to these productive spaces around the home becomes even more important. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tom. It's really inspiring to see what African Women Rising has been accomplishing in these contexts, and I especially love the plug for evidence and building that evidence base. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Sure.
And I think I'll turn over now to you, Tara Clerkin from IRC.
Great. Thanks, Kristen. And thanks to USAID and Scale for including IRC in this discussion. We're happy to be able to share some of the lessons we've learned over the years. IRC is a large humanitarian organization, and we implement a wide range of food security and agricultural programming. And we take a really broad approach working across the arc of a crisis. Increasingly, we're seeing pressure for communities to do more with less. Less land, less water resources, and less mobility. I think we're all seeing that right now in the current context as COVID and the locust crises are limiting mobility, as well as many protracted crises and conflicts in the world. So we've seen a need for us to really look at small-scale agroecological approaches and how we can integrate and promote them more in our programming, while sticking to our main themes that are very in line with what Tom and Warren have both presented on, looking at how we can increase production, build resilience to climate change, address underlying causes of undernutrition, and focus on USAID's climate smart principles, using a systems approach, really being intentional about the design, looking at ways that we incorporate multiple benefits, making this tailored to specific contexts, not only in terms of the agroecological zone, but also the needs and desires of the clients, and then having a long-term perspective, even in humanitarian contexts where our programming might have a shorter timeline. Next slide. Today I'm talking about an example that our team in Yemen was able to implement last year under an OFDA project. This was a multi-sectoral humanitarian program, including cash transfers, health, and nutrition in Al-Dali Governorate. We wanted to include kitchen gardening to provide localized food security solutions for households with malnourished children. The nutrition team referred all of the households who participated in the kitchen gardening activity, and the women were the main household members targeted. Next slide. We used resilient design and regenerative practices throughout the project. Here I'm going to highlight what we did in the project and then what we are looking to do moving forward as we go through to the next iteration of this project. First, there was a huge focus on localizing food security. The main purpose of this kitchen garden program was providing households with malnourished children localized right on their property next door access to nutritious food. We worked with the Ministry of Agriculture to select locally appropriate and available seed varieties, including nutrient-dense crops with a focus on leafy greens. We were very successful in increasing home production of these nutritious crops. Most households in the project were able to produce enough for their household. Some were also able to share with neighbors not participating in the project. Moving forward to the next iteration, we want to respond to the interest from the participants in including income generation of key spices and high value crops in this model of kitchen gardening and small space production as well. We also want to more intentionally address seed security. As I said, we worked with the Ministry of Agriculture to identify appropriate seed varieties, but given the high cost of seeds in the local market, as well as of risks to availability, given market access disruptions, like current crises, including conflict and now COVID, we want to make sure that we are going beyond just simple germination testing to working with the participants so that they understand how to save the best seeds and store them safely for future seasons. We also had a huge focus on community engagement that led to the success of our program. Targeting women, we needed to make sure that we had buy-in from leaders in the community and men in a socially conservative area. We also, like Warren and Tom said, had a huge focus on both water and soil, focusing on how we can use gray water and other water resources and invest in the fertility of the soil as a productive asset for future years. In future programs, we're planning on doubling down on this focus on soil fertility, as well as looking at ways that we can expand the use of gray water into also water harvesting and storage using permaculture techniques. We also had a huge focus on seasonality and education of the ecosystem and when they should be growing certain crops. That was really well received by the participants in the program, and so we want to continue to be able to do that so that we can equip the participants in programs like this to make the seasons and the weather and their ecosystem work for them. Turn it over to you, Kristen.
Yeah, thank you, Tara. Thanks for that. And I really liked how you showed how those multi-sectoral components are really tied together through IRC's approach. Meredith from Helen Keller International, I'll turn over to you now.
Thank you. Thanks for having Helen Keller here. Today I want to talk about our programs. Helen Keller's been doing our agroecological approach to gardens is centered on our goal of improving nutrition. We've been doing homestead food production for over 40 years, and we started with home gardens as a way to combat malnutrition by improving access to diverse nutritious foods, primarily for pregnant and lactating women and children under 5 years of age. Over the years, our approach has expanded to include nutrition and hygiene, social and behavior change communication, and building business and financial literacy skills to get access to income through on-farm income generation, and to take a gender transformative household approach by including other family members like husbands and mothers-in-law to support women to improve household well-being. Our farmers, who are mostly women, perceive benefits because they gain skills to produce food without the use of chemicals at little to no cost, and they provide diverse, nutritious foods for their families and safeguard family health and hygiene while earning income. And though each program that we have in our different countries has its own emphasis, we capacitate agriculture and health volunteers and sometimes WASH volunteers to become community resources to sustain beyond the life of project, and often establish local input suppliers through our farmers. Next slide, please. I want to talk today about Sapling, which is a Food for Peace funded development food security activity that we're implementing in the Chittagong Hill Tracts region of southeastern Bangladesh. Sapling reaches over 48,000 households through homestead food production as part of an integrated multi-sector approach that improves food security, nutrition, disaster management, and all of this is to increase resilience capacity of our households. The real strength of Sapling is that it works along different pathways to resilience, which includes food production and increases access to diversified financial assets like savings and internal lending. But we also work at a systems level to increase access to water, health services, safety nets, markets, emergency response, and disaster management response. And because we're working in an area prone to disaster with frequent droughts, floods, landslides, elephant raids, rat infestations, we knew we needed a more comprehensive multi-sector approach to work from the local to the national level. And it's a post-conflict area with 12 distinct ethnic groups. In Sapling, we include home gardens, poultry production, and aquaculture where feasible, as well as small-scale production for income. And we have marketing groups that help get the produce to the market to earn income and get diversified, nutritious foods into the markets. We also, each of our interventions has been carefully designed to promote gender equality and social inclusion so that members of households support women to produce food and earn income, but also so that ethnic minorities and women are represented in decision-making bodies. Next slide, please. In Sapling, one intervention that we really want to highlight is that increases resilience capacity is the Family Nutrition Center. These are community group managed gardens, which were initiated as a recovery effort after 94% of our households lost their productive assets, mostly chickens and gardens, in floods and landslides in 2019. And this was the second time in 4 years that we'd seen devastating losses to our participant households. We decided to provide conditional cash transfers to the Family Nutrition Centers to create a quick source, about roughly 90 days, of nutritious foods and inputs to restock the lost inputs they had grown for their homestead food production, and so they could use those inputs and reestablish their home gardens almost immediately. But what happened was the most interesting part. The process yielded some of the key self-reliance outcomes that go beyond producing nutritious food and garden inputs. Our groups were guided to think through the why, that they had to garden for family nutrition, and then had to come up with the how, that with this money, what can you do and how can you do it? And they figured out where they would plant, and through a coaching tool on nutritious crops, they decided what they wanted to grow, figured out where to source the starter inputs locally, and agreed on how to manage the garden and how to divide the produce, seedlings, saplings, and seeds. This facilitated management process, the working together with defined roles and responsibilities, gathered community support from men and traditional leaders, and helped members learn to negotiate and facilitate problem solving, and empowered women because they were decision makers, and motivated them because they saw tangible results. It built personal agency, self-efficacy, and self-reliance in some. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Meredith. I really like how you shared how the nutrition, the gender equity, and the social inclusion components of Sapling's work really came forth through these small-scale production solutions. I also want to note, I see some of our participants are starting to share tools and resources in the chat box, so that's great, and we certainly encourage that. And now to wrap us up, I'll turn the next 5 minutes over to Natalie Topa, from the Danish Refugee Council.
Thanks, Kristen, and good evening from Nairobi. I'm going to talk about the 3 scales that we're trying to apply agroecological principles to in DRC, in East Africa and Great Lakes region. I think COVID has proven something that we already knew all along, which is food security cannot and should not be a function of the market, because markets fail, but our need to eat remains very much intact. And also the other thing is that the catalog of interventions to address food security within COVID and LOVID, if you're talking about locusts, are the same as the ones for climate action. So agroecology is the only option for climate action. So here, the first scale I'm talking about is the Permagarden scale around the households. We're first starting, I work very closely with Warren Brush and also with Tom Cole, who's been with us in Somalia. You know, we start around our compound so that our own offices can become learning hubs and demonstration sites. All the things that other speakers have talked about, we use methods of working with communities to use locally available materials, especially under containment measures with restricted movements. People need to be able to use what they have around them. But we also are using the element of design, permaculture design. Resilience design is really about permaculture. And so using water harvesting features, the soil, building soil health and fertility is something very, very key, using only what people have, and we really understand that knowledge is the main input here. Looking down below, these 2 examples are a permagarden that we did in Uganda with a South Sudanese refugee. And again, this is just a couple months later. She has a very, very thriving garden, even though when she arrived here, she was using soils and, a landscape that she was totally unfamiliar with. If we go to the next slide, I'll talk about how we take these same principles and move that into the farm level. So we work with our teams, with local government, with displacement affected populations, that's refugees, IDPs, and host community members. And here what we want to do is bring food security and climate action together. We want to buffer from some extreme weather behavior and water events. And we do that by designing farms to harvest and harness all the energy that's passing through that system, water, nutrient, and leverage that in a way that both drought proofs and flood proofs the farm, so that we can increase resilience, increase agrobiodiversity, meeting greater needs, and really focusing on nutrition per acre rather than yield per acre. And so it's about taking the design and these principles from the permagarden to the farm level to provide things like food, fodder, fiber, fuel, and fertility. Those are 5 main F's we talk about in permaculture. So if we go on to the last slide, we understand that addressing, there are all kinds of forces. A farm or a household is not just an island. It's connected to a lot of different things, catchments, weather patterns, solar orientation. And so these are the, understanding that we can take these same principles out now to the community and landscape level. Here are some examples of how we are integrating this into infrastructure with large-scale infrastructure and road water harvesting, turning floods into food or turning water from destruction into production. So here's some examples of doing path water harvesting where we design to divert water from pathways, like here in Burundi, in the upper left-hand corner. That water accumulates and creates major erosion gullies that eats farms alive. So we're focusing on getting that water from a destructive, erosive energy into a productive energy onto farms. But this also mitigates landslides, flash floods. So even the way that we plant trees is for water harvesting. We want systems, communities, landscapes all to be really traps for water. And so again, I think this just proves that, taking these same principles to the scale of landscapes, communities, watersheds, we can buffer people from the extreme events that are caused by ecological degradation, possibly even more so than climate change. So I think I'll wrap up there.
Thanks, Natalie. I really love how you've just brought us from the household scale up to that larger landscape level. So it's really great to see how DRC is applying those principles at such a wide scale. So I want to shift us now. We can go ahead and close out the slide deck for a minute. And I want to shift our presenters over to discussing a little bit about how these small-scale agroecological solutions are rooted in the current context. We know that this COVID-19 pandemic has brought a whole range of disruptions, particularly for many of the communities that we're working with. There's market closures, there's travel restrictions, there's new challenges in accessing basic supplies and inputs. And so I want to shift us towards what is this looking like in the programs you're working on, and what kind of solutions are you starting to see? And I'd like to start with you, Meredith. What are some of the COVID-related impacts that you're seeing in the programs that you support? How have your garden-related interventions been impacted?
Well, I think in terms of how things have been impacted, one of the biggest things I think we all need to remember is that this is an unprecedented type of disaster, you know, a once in 100-year event. So I just want to start with that. It's something that we may not have been able to anticipate the type of impact it's having on such a large scale. And for example, in Asia, COVID is hit during the peak of the dry season. And while our farming techniques, our gardening techniques are there to mitigate the disruption of farming and to promote during the dry season and promote year-round production, there are still households that have little access to water, and those households tend to have alternate livelihoods options during this time of year. So in Vietnam, Nepal, Myanmar, and Bangladesh, in areas where the lockdown has been strictly enforced, households who have food production have reported, our frontline field staff have reported that these households have access to food, that they've been able to continue to consume nutritious, diverse foods. But for those households who weren't producing food, they're experiencing critical food shortages now with the restricted movement and the inability to sell perhaps small-scale agriculture cash crops or find daily wage labor.
Yeah, thanks for that, Meredith. I think the challenges that you just shared are probably ones that are quite familiar to many of our participants on this call now as well, in the communities that they're supporting and living in. So thanks for pulling that forward. One aspect of the current crisis is definitely around these social distancing requirements and the travel restrictions. And amongst the many impacts, of course, are constraints on the ability of program staff to meet with and reach the communities that they work with. So I'm wondering, how have garden-related trainings continued to roll out in spite of these restrictions? How are your programs pivoting or continuing these trainings despite these constraints? And Natalie, I'd like to turn to you if you could share a bit about what DRC's been doing.
Yeah, so this is actually even in, before COVID. You know, there was a training that I had done with Warren and Kakuma, and we really try to invite people from different sectors so that we really can have an integrated and intersectoral approach. We had a young man named Abdi Wahab, who is a WASH team leader from Somalia, from Mogadishu. He was so inspired by the training that despite not being a livelihoods focal point person, he went back to Mogadishu and actually went out with his WASH team, and they trained a group of 20 initial women. They didn't have a budget. They had no project. They had no money. I think they borrowed some seeds from another program, but they really explained this whole process, this whole concept to the women in the camp of resource recovery and harnessing all of the different types of resources that may be viewed as waste or just discarded materials around the camp and around the households. And they showed them how those can be converted into healthy soils for intensive food production. So, you know, again, there was no project, there was no budget, but these 20 women, they started to do it, and then started posting on Mouthbook, as I say, when you have no internet. So they started to share that information among themselves, and it started to grow to 50 gardens, to 70, and now we have more than 100 gardens. And that just goes to show that knowledge is the main input here. People can really do this in a self-reliant way. They don't have to rely on anyone else. And so again, it's just spreading like wildfire because women are connecting with one another and sharing, and they're demonstrating amongst themselves, and they don't need anyone else to move forward with this. One of those women had such a successful garden that it actually prompted her to repatriate to her village, which is a very big risk from a security perspective. But she was so inspired by what she was able to do at her refugee shelter, her IDP shelter rather, that she went back to her place of origin, and she started to work with the women in her community, successfully doing that now. So this is just to show that this approach of using locally available materials is really so relevant right now during these containment measures.
Thanks so much for that, Natalie. I think the power of those community catalysts is really inspiring. Tom, I was wondering if you wanted to jump in with what's happening on the AWR side.
Sure, great, thank you. A really broad range of experiences here, and I'm seeing sort of in the chat box as well. I think this is a great space to talk about this. What we're seeing in Palabek Refugee Camp as you're moving into the rainy period, this is sort of oftentimes the main hunger lean season as the rains begin before normal crops might be growing. But now with sort of decreased mobility, we're seeing those gardens, those permagardens that are based around these principles actually being even that much more important. So I think, as Meredith said from Helen Keller, a lot of those gardens are highly productive right now. And the team on the ground is sort of shifting some of their modalities. Instead of group work, it's more sort of one-on-one monitoring and support for these gardens. Though obviously with sort of the distancing. I just wanted to jump on one question someone had about this lateral adoption. Like how do you get this other people who are sort of not targeted beneficiaries involved? And I think one of the key things that's coming through all of these is many of these, this is based around principles as opposed to a set of defined activities. And the principles are around capturing water, banking water deep into the soil, building soil fertility through the use of local resources. And so I know when you're able to do that, and neighbors see that, wow, you got the same rainfall I did, but why is your moringa plant or why is your garden growing much quicker than mine? So just talking about principles as opposed to a defined set of activities.
Yeah, thanks for tying that in, Tom. I really appreciate that. And thanks again to our participants here for keeping those questions rolling in. Warren, I want to give you a chance to also weigh in on perhaps what Tom just said, but also if you want to return to the topic around remote training, because I know you've been working with us on the SCALE team with one of our Food for Peace funded programs in DRC through a remote mentorship program. So I'm curious if you want to kind of share a little bit about what that's about and what it might offer in this current context.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Kristen, and thank you to all the other panelists here. One of the benefits we're seeing right now during the COVID crisis is these relationships that we've developed that we refer to as mentoring relationships with technical teams in the field. We have been working with doing trainings with resilience design, which encompasses the household permagarden with the Food for Peace teams in the DRC. And what we found is the need for technical guidance to work with them in a way that allows their deep questions and the things that are working and are not working, their opportunities and their constraints, to be able to have some technical backstopping to assist them to have productive systems in the field. So over this last year and a half, we've been working with a team there that has to use interesting ways of sharing technical needs. So we have crews that have smartphones with types of apps that actually embed directional data, GPS data. They can go out to a stickling point in the landscape or in a garden, and they can say, yeah, we're having a problem with this, and then use this app to capture a lot of data so that us as remote technical advisors can actually work with them through the different issues that might be going on with them through our experience. Now, during COVID, that has actually been really helpful because we've, with the social distancing, we've been able to continue with the technical support during this time. The other thing that's developed out of this was that the team there wanted to have a series of videos that they could share, low-res videos in the field, and so we were able to pull from what our past technical advice to them and actually help develop a list of videos that they could develop to help them in training during this time of social distancing. So it's been something for us that we're finding technical integrity is really important in agroecology, and I'll leave it with that.
Yeah, thanks for that, Warren, and thanks for driving through that point at the end. I think you're really right about ensuring the technical integrity and these different strategies that we now have to use as we're adapting to make sure that we continue to hit the mark. Tara, I want to move over to you now because you mentioned earlier how IRC's approach specifically targets and mobilizes women in the gardening interventions. And so I wanted to ask you, what gender-specific considerations should partners keep in mind as they look to pivot and adapt their program in these contexts to ensure that we're being gender equitable?
Yeah, it's a great question, Kristen. And I think there's two questions. There's one of how do we adapt existing programming? And then there's the question of how do we design future programming to be flexible and more adaptable? One of the aspects that we have been emphasizing as we're working with our country programs on adapting existing programming is really taking into consideration how all pre-existing inequalities and disparities in access will only be exacerbated right now under the current crisis. So we need to make sure that we're considering differences in access to ICT technologies and building in multiple modalities, not just phone and not just smartphone, but considering radio and other ways of communicating out messaging that women have access to and can easily participate in. And then we also need to address gaps in literacy. We found this in the Yemen program just in our normal key informant interviews afterwards and focus group discussions, that our approach was too dependent on women being literate, and that we needed to make sure that any give outs that we gave to people really were considering the fact that low literacy populations needed to be able to understand them. I think that translates to how we're pushing out training and messaging from a more remote standpoint. That we need to consider that radio and IVR technologies are easier for low literacy populations to participate in. I think in the chat, there's a really good question about market linkages with ICT as well. And I think it's good for us to, again, make sure that we're not being gender blind and how we think about how we can leverage ICT to make sure that men and women are accessing market opportunities.
Thanks so much for that, Tara. Really excellent points. Tom, did you want to respond to something there?
Yeah, just another comment in the chat box, just talking about in dry lands or arid lands, and how are these practices or principles as as valid in the dry lands, and oftentimes we get that. And I think if you saw that slide from Somalia, from the Danish Refugee Council's work in Dalo, and really across the dry lands, I've been working in a number of the refugee camps in eastern Chad with Darfuri refugees, basing the program around the same principles of capturing water and using a lot of the local materials to build the microbial life in the soil and allowing plants to access that water and nutrients, you have tremendous results in the dry lands. So offline, we can talk more about this, but these are approaches that work equally well in heavy rainfall and in very little rainfall.
Natalie, I see you have a hand. We could have just one quick comment before we jump ahead to this next session.
Yeah, I think that during this emergency, a lot of cash modalities are being employed, and I do think there's a way to think about how to bridge cash-based interventions with market systems development. So, for example, one thing that we're doing is looking at how might we incentivize certain tree species to be grown in nurseries. And definitely we know that food security starts with seed security and sovereignty. And so how do we profile farmers and producers who are producing and saving seeds, and how can we use cash-based interventions during the emergency to try to unlock those economic contestants so that we can avail those in the local market side by side with, or maybe not, that may be the only option for seeds. So thinking about in the emergency, what are the tools that are we employing, and how can we bridge into the recovery and stimulate the kind of markets that are more resilient and regenerative, and definitely supporting informal seed systems.
Yeah, excellent point. And Meredith, I see you've got your hand up there. So if you want to close this out with one last comment for this session.
Yeah, just a real final comment is just to reemphasize, I see someone has asked about agroecological approaches during COVID, and it goes back to the first question. The gardens are helping people during COVID. If they have a garden, they are providing food, and they are being shared among community members. And we're seeing that, and I think everyone is seeing that in their programs now. And I just wanted to make that final point.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Meredith. And I don't want to cut off this great conversation, but we're actually moving to a next session where I think we can continue to build on some of these discussion points. So recognizing that we have so many practitioners on the call, we wanted to create some space for us to be able to share and exchange with one another and to continue this conversation in smaller breakout groups. So what's going to be happening in the next couple minutes is that everyone on this call will be automatically placed into a small breakout group. You will have one of the speakers, one or two of these speakers with you in that group, along with a scale support staff. And before I lose any introverts on the call, I should note that you can participate in the breakout group both through a shared collaborative sheet that we have, as well as being able to speak up in conversation. So when you go into that group, you're going to have a scale staff member is going to be dropping a Google chat link into your chat box. Julia, maybe you could pull up that slide so I can show everyone what to expect. Thank you, that's perfect. So when you get into your group, head over to your Google chat box, click on that link, and a collaborative Google Sheet that looks something like what you see here will pop up. You'll have a few minutes to be able to populate that together with members of your group. Each of you will have a different topic, a technical topic at the top. You'll see there's two sections to this table. On the left, you can feel free to plug in any key challenges or questions that your agency is facing related to that topic. And then on the right, to share strategies, resources, innovations, or other solutions that you as your organization or other organizations are working on to address those challenges. So after a few minutes of kind of populating this and getting familiar with what other people are putting in, your speaker will then help lead you through a conversation together on this topic where you'd be able to interact directly with one another. So to facilitate that, if you're comfortable, when you get into the groups, we'd ask that you go ahead and turn on your video camera. And if you'd like to speak, you can click on the raise hand function, a button at the bottom of your screen, or you can physically raise your hand to signal to the speakers and the support staff in the room that you'd like to contribute something. After the breakout groups, we'll have about 20 minutes together. We'll share a couple key takeaways, and following the event, we'll pull together all of these great sheets, these resources, your thoughts and questions into a combined document that we can help circulate out further to support the wider community. If you're having any technical trouble at all, you can continue to use the chat box in your breakout to let the Scale staff know that you're having a bit of a problem, and they'll help address that for you. You can also reference the second page of your Google Sheet for a bit more technological guidance. So with that, I think we're ready to move on into our breakout groups. You'll get a little bit more guidance there. And I hope everyone has a fantastic conversation. Thank you, everyone, and welcome back. It's good to see so many video cameras on and to get a sense of who else is in the room with us. I hope you all had some really productive conversations. I know on the ag input and the market side, we really had a flurry of activities in pulling out this, populating out this document. I wanted to turn over to my fellow speakers if anyone wanted to share a takeaway or something interesting that came up in their group. Are there any interesting questions or a key challenge that it seemed like people really focused in on?
I'll start.
Thanks, Meredith.
I think two big challenges that came up were the water scarcity in especially dry zones. How do you really mitigate that water scarcity during a time like this, even when we are promoting the types of water saving technologies and techniques that we do? And another key issue that or solution that Tom brought up was using drought resilient and flood resilient varieties of seeds that are also nutrient dense as a source of as a way to kind of mitigate more ongoing disasters as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. Did anyone else have something similar or want to build off that point?
I think in our group, I mean, we were looking at access to ag inputs and markets, but really it was broader than that. And sort of a thread that really came out was rethinking of how we communicate with our farmers through WhatsApp messaging, through bulk messages, and SMS, sending short videos, photos, the use of radio, sort of one way, and radio talk groups. So it's sort of two-way communication. So those were some ideas of sort of morphing or pivoting from traditional ways of communication to being a little bit more nimble in this time with restricted mobility.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tom. Tara.
Yeah, so I'll, building on what Tom was saying about thinking about how we push out information, a theme that came up in our group was also how do we get information? And right now we're producing a lot of guidance, and we're thinking about how we make sure that we are still training or pushing out resources, but we don't necessarily understand the needs and what are the priorities of the populations that we're serving. And so I think that is a big challenge that we will need as an industry to address and solve, is how can we effectively make sure that we're accessing the right people to ask them what their needs are, especially when we're talking about food security and nutrition needs of the most vulnerable.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Thanks for that, Tara.
I can talk about our discussion in breakout group number 4. So a couple things came up. One was about market access and seeds. Andrea mentioned, we talked about the importance of sort of returning to seed systems that are more resilient and more regenerative and indigenous. But also Andrea offered that yesterday was the webinar, the FSN webinar on seed systems. And so encouraging people to go and find that and check that out. Another one was just in terms of urban density and food security. And I shared a video on my own balcony, permaculture, where I grow chickens and mushrooms and a lot of food. But the notion of taking the verticality of food production, having three-dimensional gardens, and especially in urban environments, we have so many resources and waste streams that can be turned into value streams, not only for food, but even livelihoods. So what I mentioned is that, you know, globally, we're in this moment of transformation. Our agencies, our industries, our thinking also have to be transforming right now. So how we move into circular bioeconomy, how we do resource recovery, or integrated waste management, and how that's folded into innovation around food production is something that's key. And then somebody mentioned one of my favorite topics, humanure. So yes, humanure is a major resource. It's a nutrient, it's nitrogen, and the way that humans design our sewerage and all those systems from municipal level is just wrong. It's degenerative. It takes energy to dispose of it, and where we dispose of it becomes a Disneyland of disease instead of creating, you know, going back into the system in a regenerative way. So whether it's camps or in our programs, you know, identifying where it might be contextually appropriate and culturally acceptable to start to test how we harness all of the, you know, the opportunities around the resource of human nutrient.
Yeah, thanks for linking that in, Natalie. I really appreciate that. It wasn't the direction I was expecting it to go, but I'm glad that you guys had that expansive conversation. We're able to touch on this range of interventions. Abby, I see a few questions have popped up from the group that you were in, a little more process-wise. So I want to make sure that I address this while we're still all on the call together. One is, how will people be able to continue adding to this document? I see that people are even continuing to do that right now, which is fantastic. We will continue to leave those open, and you can continue to populate them. I can leave them open through the rest of the day even. I see some of these points need a lot of discussion at the local level. Do we have the opportunity to discuss back at the office or community and share questions and respond by a day or two? Yeah, absolutely. What I'm planning to do is to start pulling together all these great notes and resources into one combined document that everyone will be able to see. So you're aware of what was happening in the other groups. And we can leave that as a collaborative document where you can continue to add to it for some time. Let's see. Is there any quality control of the resources that will be shared through this document? You know, on that point, that's kind of a tricky one. I think we're going to have to rely on all of you. If you're finding resources that have been helpful to your context and the populations that you're working with, then I think we'll lean on your expertise for that, make them available, and for everyone to use their own judgment if it fits their needs as well. So I don't see ourselves taking a heavy hand to culling any resources that you found useful, but I think we'll see a diversity of different strategies here. As we wrap up, I think there's just a couple points that I wanted to reflect on what I saw really come through strong throughout this whole session. A lot of it pulls me back to, Warren, how you started the conversation around the importance of having this relationship with what sustains us. And if you feed and you nourish the water and the soil and the foundations of our production systems, you end up building local food systems that can be resilient across a range of different shocks and stresses. And while we're talking about COVID right now, we know that it's also LOVID, as Natalie talked about, the locust. It's multiple shocks and stresses that our communities are facing. And so when we look at this moment of transformation and rebuilding our food systems, if we do it in ways that are getting back to the root causes, strengthening the water use, strengthening our soil, we'll be able to address that range of stresses and shocks much more strongly moving forward. So I really appreciated how that piece of multiple shocks and stresses has come in even on this COVID-focused conversation. Another thing that stood out to me is really the multi-sectoral opportunities for building on small-scale agroecological production. So we saw how IRC, how Helen Keller are addressing nutritional needs, gender equity, and social equity issues, building off of a gardening or small-scale agroecological production solution. And finally, what really sticks out to me and was re-emphasized with Natalie quite a bit was moving these principles from a homestead or small-scale household level up to a larger landscape or regional scale. And so I think that's something really important to keep in mind as we focus more on the small scale here, that those same principles really apply at larger levels as well. And inspiration from what DRC and others are doing at those large landscapes really helps to motivate us and see what else is possible. So as we close up here, I just wanted to take a moment again to thank everyone for making this such a strong event. Thank you, Charlie Davis from Food for Peace, Tom, Tara, Meredith, Natalie, thank you all so much for sharing your presentations. Warren for setting us up on a good foot from the beginning. And all of you for being so willing to share your resources and your challenges and participate in this conversation here. So you'll be getting, we'll share at the recording after this event. Julia will drop an evaluation link into the chat box that we'd appreciate if you could all fill out. And we'll be back in touch with this resource document and hope to engage all of you in future events as well. So on that, I think I will wrap us up. Julia, if you could just flash up that scale slide at the end. So at the FSN network, here's where you can find some more resources, tools, and sign up for a newsletter to stay on top of what's going on. So with that, I'll close out. Thank you once again, everyone. Stay safe, and we look forward to engaging in the future.